Good afternoon. So Zoe, the workplace today has been so changed by technology, by globalization, and it really seems like there's an interesting dance going on between talented workers who want jobs, employers who want to hire workers, but they just can't seem to get into sync. Talk to us about what is happening. Is it the skills gap? Is the skills gap real? And what is Markle doing to address all this?
We started in about 2011 or 2012 looking at the question of how digitization was going to change work and people's lives and how the economy was changing. And one of the things that we saw then was that when we moved from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, we invented the high school. We invented the institutions that enabled people to get the knowledge they needed and the understanding of the infrastructure of that economy. And as we moved into the digital economy, we're in a every man for himself, every woman for themselves world, and we haven't created the institutions that are needed for people to be able to make that transition. So what we've been working on is trying to get employers to hire on the same kind of granular skills basis that we learn things when we go online or that are relevant in a networked world. We're trying to get educators to train in that way, whether they be institutions or online educators like my colleague here. And we're also working on trying to have people understand how they can have market power in this economy through the things they know how to do.
So is this the so-called skill-based economy that you're trying to work toward?
Right, absolutely.
Well, Austen, you are dealing in one of these fields where there really is a big imbalance between the number of jobs and then the number of workers to fill them. Code.org, in their latest survey, was back in 2017, they found there were 550,000 open jobs in that needed computer science skills. Yet that year, fewer than 50,000 students graduated with computer science degrees. So how are you addressing this imbalance in a new and really unique way?
Upfront tuition, and students don't pay us anything unless they get a job making more than $50,000 a year. And that has de-risked it for students, so now you don't have to worry about, how much student debt am I taking on? What is this going to look like on the other side? And that just opens up the top of the funnel to students who would otherwise not be able to participate.
So describe to us your average student then, your typical student.
Yeah, so as far as age goes, it's kind of a bell curve right around 31. But we have students as young as 18, students as old as 60.
Wow.
We have our average student is coming in making $27,000 a year. Our average student goes out making $76,000 a year. So we focus on that delta, on how can we help people get into a lasting career as quickly and in as risk-free manner as possible.
Zoe, are operations like Austen's needed because the traditional university degree, has that fallen short? I know that, when I was growing up, it was like, get the degree, get that sheepskin, it's a golden ticket, it will open all the doors, you will be a success. And there's some really interesting research by Peter Capelli, director of Wharton School Center for Human Resources. He's looked at this and he says the correlation when it comes to college grades and job performance, he says they are, quote, poorly related. It is remarkable how frequently companies rely on hiring criteria for which there is no evidence of it working.
So I don't think it's right to say that college isn't valuable. Let's not swing the pendulum too far to the other side. We need highly trained people to compete globally, let alone to grow our opportunities domestically. But what we've done that has been so misguided is for decades we've been saying to people singularly, go to college, get a 4-year degree, and you'll succeed.
Full stop.
Absolutely. And we have failed to say to people that's only one of the many ways you can succeed, and to create the capacity for people to get rapid and affordable learning and to demonstrate the skills they have. I mean, I always think of the auto mechanic who's learned to repair a car engine in their neighbor's garage. That person's a great candidate to repair robots. They just don't know it. So they need to have the coaches and counselors to go to. They need to have the capacity on places like LinkedIn. You just heard from our friends we've collaborated with at LinkedIn. They need to have ways to represent their skills, and employers need to have the capacity to understand what the skills are that they need in the jobs they're trying to fill.
How
so
do you
that they
persuade
can
them?
find that
Right. How do you
person.
persuade employers, though, to let go of those traditional proxies? You know, we require for your degree, we require this certificate.
Increasingly, and we have a Rework America business network of a dozen of the largest employers in the country, and we're growing that. We also have networks of small and medium-sized businesses, and what we're working on with them is using tools we've developed and tools that others have to disaggregate the skills needed in a job so that something like this training program can be fit into a system rather than his having to negotiate one-off contracts with employers to hire his folks. And if the whole system works that way, and if the online networks that we all use work that way and represent the skills people have, then everyone can thrive. And importantly, workers have the ability to both know how to go after higher paying jobs and how to represent themselves and be respected for the things that they know how to do, as opposed to the present economy where we say to most people, we value what you don't have. And so I think, excuse me, we see this as we look at how people feel about inclusion in this country. We see it as we look at people's view of government. People believe these institutions are leaving them out, and a lot of it has to do with this lack of respect for the skills they have and their capacity to contribute to the economy and the importance of feeling good about your work to your well-being.
Austen, what's your take on all this? And in particular, when it comes to your school, Lambda School, after 9 months, what kind of credential do your students graduate with, and how are employers receiving it?
Yeah, so first and foremost, you know, I don't have a college degree myself, and my generation was very much taught the similar. You know, it was the golden ticket. If you get a degree, you're magically hireable forever. And I look around at my friends and people who are my age in high school, and that's just fundamentally not true. In fact, for many of them, and pains us to say it, they would have been better off if they hadn't gone to a university from a sheerly financial perspective. So the tricky thing for us is we don't really give you a credential per se. We don't give you anything that's recognized by the government, but we started in a field that is relatively meritocratic, where if you can pass a coding interview, then you're a good hire. Now, the trick for our students is getting their foot in the door, getting through that resume, submitting a resume into a black hole when you used to be working at a fast food restaurant. You may be just as good of a programmer as someone with a CS degree, but employers don't generally look at that the same way. So our solve for that is we basically have a 30-person sales team that gets on the phone with all the employers and says, just give them a shot. Just, here's what we go through. Here's the curriculum. Here's what they had to go through just to get to this point, and it's as rigorous as anything someone's gone through in a university classroom. So just give them a shot, and we line up interviews for the students, and it works really, really well.
Well, what is your success rate?
So we right now see 80% of our students hired within 120 days of graduation, and then it keeps going up from there.
Excellent. Zoe, let's talk about on-the-job training, because there's some really interesting numbers, again, from the same professor, Capelli at Wharton. And he found that in 1979, the average young worker received 2.5 weeks a year of training. 1979. By 95, that had dropped to 11 hours of training a year. And then by 2011, only 20% of employees reported receiving any on-the-job training of any sort within the previous 5 years. So what's going on, and how damaging is that?
So there was a real transition in work that the statistics reflect but don't focus on, which is that at the beginning of that period, most people work for the same employer for their whole career. And starting in the 80s and definitely by the early 90s, I mean, the early 90s, I was saying things like more new hires work for women-owned small businesses than work for Fortune 500 companies. So there was a huge transition that took place, and it's not just people who are trained by their employers, but they were trained by unions. You had great leader of the SEIU this morning, and you heard about union training. I mean, my father was a labor union officer, and when I was a kid, I loved going to the union hall. These guys were radio operators on ships, and when they were off the ships, they'd come into the union hall and they'd get retrained, and it was great. But today, we need to get employers back to training their workers on the job where people are, because it's very hard for people in this day and age with the pace of life to go somewhere to get trained. So we need to create much more training in the workplace, and we also need to take some of the great training that's done by unions and by there are other organizations represented here that train people, get these trainings into workplaces, even if people aren't members of unions. This is something I've certainly been pushing unions to do, is to take your great training. The percentage of people who are in unions is so small these days. That training should be marketed and invested in people who aren't members of the unions too. And I think the workforce realizes that this is a big gap. We did a study in 2016, which really surprised me. We did this with Pew, and we were looking at a lot of issues about how people expected to succeed, and 87% of Americans said that they needed to get training throughout their life in order to succeed in the workplace. 43% said they'd be better off if their workforce was unionized. So there is a recognition that people who sit in policy-making circles or in businesses, even in journalism, don't necessarily see that people are seeing in their own work lives.
Now, Austen, is it any wonder that there was a 2015 Gallup poll that found millennials change jobs 3 times more often than the preceding generations, and when they get jobs, they're less engaged than any other generation before them? I mean, when employers don't seem to want to invest in them, an employer buys a piece of equipment, that's an asset. They train the employees to have a new skill, and that's a cost. How do we change that mindset so that they value human capital?
Yeah, and I think that's one of those things that it's tricky to know what was the cause and what was the effect, right? Are people leaving more often because employers are investing less, or are employers investing less because people are leaving more often? One thing we found is that employers, generally speaking, would love to train people, but they're just not very good at it oftentimes. It's a very unique skill set, and it's an ability that employers don't have embedded the same way other HR functionalities are already there. So we're actually seeing more and more employers willing to pay for that and view their employees as a resource instead of a cost center. And I think that's the fundamental shift that has to happen. And then they're looking externally for someone who can figure that out, because the bandwidth and the thought processes are not always, it's not top of mind, unfortunately. I think as companies get older and more established and they see more turnover, that's fortunately starting to force them to think about, what can I do to help people stay here? What do I do to help them move up the career ladder by my intention, not by theirs? So it's a tricky question, but yeah.
That is something that we're working on in the companies we work with, are attentive to the need to change the tax laws so that we do treat investment in human capital.
Is that underway anywhere at a state or federal level?
Well, it's being worked on. You can't really do it just at the state level, not the federal level. But the more important or more difficult challenge is to get people to understand and have the market power themselves to get the skills and the training they need. So if companies reveal to people what skills they have in a job, just like they reveal to people who are looking for a job what skills they need, then people can have their own skills transcript or portfolio that they can market. And it's enormously important in the world we live in today, where we don't work for the same employer our whole lives, and where jobs are going to be rapidly changing forever, that individuals have the knowledge and the market power to be able to navigate this, and the supports from counselors and coaches and the financial support from their employer and that kind of thing. But for most people, they're going to have to find a way to navigate with their unique capacities, and we just need to power that for people so that they're not just left alone trying to figure out how to patch together 5 jobs in order to make a living.
Let's go to the questions that are already starting to come in. This is from Anonymous. Austen said coding is meritocratic, but research has shown that there are big disparities in opportunity based on race in that field. How do you overcome that, Austen?
Well, first and foremost, I said it's relatively meritocratic. And, if you talk to employers, it's first and foremost a top of the funnel problem. So the problem is that there are fundamentally not enough people getting into that field in the first place. So, if I'm Google, regardless of what I try to do on the hiring side, if there aren't people who have computer science skills from various backgrounds coming in, I can accept more of the people. I can look for more diversity, but then it's a zero-sum game. Our fundamental belief is that it's not a zero-sum game, and we need to be spending our effort and energy bringing folks in who are not in the industry, who are opting out, who can't afford the risk, and who don't have somebody around them to tell them, here's how you self-train to become a software engineer.
Zoe, here's a question for you, because we were discussing this before we came out when we were downstairs. How do people reskill when it comes to soft skills instead of the technical skills? For example, resume formats have changed, networking has changed. You and I were discussing that older Americans, many of those who have lost their jobs because of offshoring and things like that, are better with these soft skills.
Excuse me. There's the question of reskilling, but there's also the question of recognizing skills. So we had a focus group with a 40-year-old female FedEx truck driver in it, and she was worried she couldn't lift the boxes much longer. And we demonstrated how she had this whole range of both technical skills and soft skills: time management skills, customer relations skills, skills in using technology, because FedEx is such a technology-driven enterprise, and that with 1 to 2 semesters of community college, she could get the skills she needed to become a computer systems administrator. Some of those being soft skills in management, and some of those being hard skills in technology. And that's why I go back to this question of empowering people to be able to represent the skills they have. So it's enormously important that we have rapid and affordable training, this sort of mini steps that you might take in healthcare, where you walk 10,000 steps a day, or you sleep 8 hours a night, those kind of micro steps that we think of in healthcare. We need to also surface and create the infrastructure for people to be able to get these skills in that micro step way in their own lives from a variety of places: online training, their employer, their neighbor, YouTube. YouTube has a great ad now about someone who skilled up watching YouTube videos. I mean, it's really remarkable what people already do, and we just need to power that for more people.
Right. And a closing lightning round: what is the one skill of the future that many people don't have, that they should have and will need as we move forward?
Ability to learn.
Zoe?
I would say the ability to put yourself forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Zoe, Austin.